Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to finish off Season 3 of United States of Terra. Kind of when I go into every single review towards the tail end of every show, I just kind of feel very sad. Because ultimately, when looking at it, usually a lot of times when a show is ended uh, far too quickly, a lot of the times it ultimately just doesn't have a very last good solid season. When watching a show like Man Seeking Woman, I was like, man, this really does not have a really good last season. And when watching other things that kind of like realized that they were going to get the boot, really we have it to where they just didn't have a very good last season to otherwise justify them going off and having there be more seasons done upon the show. Going into the second half of this season, or the second half of what is to be the last season of the show, I believe, because there's no more stuff to watch. When going into this, I was like, this is the laziest way to end a show that I have ever seen in my life. And to be brutally honest, it's the worst way to end a show. Basically, everyone is basically just going off on in going on into some town somewhere. They're just moving away. That's how they're ending the show, by everyone just moving away, which is the bizarrest way to end a show that I've ever seen in my life. Really, a lot of these episodes are reasonably just to have some kind of fruit come out of a lot of these people's stories, where Max is kind of losing his effing mind towards towards the last of these episodes. Uh, Charmaine ultimately can't even deal with her baby anymore. That's how great things are going. We end up having it to a reasonably uh, before this show is to end, Tara has to come up with a new altar before the show ends to justify us ending the show. We end up having it to where Kate's story has a quasi resolution to it. Marshall has some fruit to this whole story, but then there's also a sad loss upon Marshall's story as well. When going into this show, I am immediately just going and I'm like, why did they have to do any of the number of the stuff that they did to end this season? Because reasonably, I don't know, maybe like they were going for sympathy towards the end. They were trying to make you feel sorry for that this show is ending, I guess. Like maybe the writers were bitter. I don't know, because when looking at it, why would they end this show with deaths ultimately? Not saying that Tara died, not saying that recently we have it to where like any number of people had died, but I guess it's just like, well, I guess this person didn't want to come back to the show, so we had to write them into the show somehow, and so here you go, kind of thing. I don't know. They had to figure out some way to write this character off, or I don't know. It was so weird this second half. I'm like, this is gonna be the oddest way to end a show. Like I feel like Marshall's character like could not care of his direction of his character. Like it kind of feels very obvious than while the Marshall character was ending the show, how he's just like, well, it doesn't really matter anyways. Like when we had it to ultimately Marshall is supposed to pick out where he's supposed to go, Marshall's like, yeah, I don't think it really matters. Nothing really matters. Yeah, because this show is ending. So, when looking at it, there were, like, this show really started out really strong. Like, really strong. I thought the story was really interesting. I thought that reasonably the altars, yeah, they were seductive, but ultimately, at least, seductive sold, as far as we really had it to where the altars were at least giving something to the table for the story to ultimately make it a much more like, oh yeah, I need to keep coming to this. Where I feel as in this tail half, they kind of had to rush to try to remind you about all these altars and have their farewells at some point, and it just kind of suffered via that of just like ultimately just like, well, we don't want to spend the time to otherwise giving like we don't want to drastically change all these personas and all these altars or whatever, so ultimately let's just have Tara's character switch into T, and or let's have her just throw on a hat and she'll be Buck, or let's have her do something along the lines that's just kind of in the cheaper end, but it is still encased in one costume. Yeah, I was like, man, are they just saving as much money as humanly possible towards the tail end of this show? Because when looking at it, I'm like, they're cutting their losses. They're ultimately trying to get seemingly like what I thought was so cheap was just the fact that they completely skipped down on like actual people like switching clothes, like Tara switching clothes through most of her personas. By the tail end of this show, they just forgot all that. Because ultimately, they just had real one altar that felt more important than everyone else, and then all the other characters were just like, okay, let's splash this one in there, let's splash that one in there, just to have some kind of resolution of some of these characters. So I don't know. I just thought it was a horrible loss to otherwise go into this and approach this the way it does. So reasonably, I think that this tail half is going to be as quickly gone through and reviewed as much more so than any other review possible, because when looking at this, there honestly isn't enough going on for the tail end of a lot of these characters. If anything, yes, there is deaths, but other than that, there's not a whole lot going on. There's basically a lot of times where they don't know what to go with the story and how to end it. So, like, this is just what happens with the show where ultimately I think they gave up writing on the show. I don't know how long ago. And now here we are with just muddled episodes that are just to finish up this show. Because I can't believe that this is a way to finish a show. So, let's ultimately go on into that double fived time count to just go out of our way to say it's about that time again to spoiler time, it's about that time again to spoil this review. So we have it to where, okay, we have to showcase the characters that are, I guess, showing fruit in this episode to really have us have a bulk of a story, but we have to get through a lot of the flimsy stuff before we get to the real justifiable bulk of story here. So we end up having it to where Tara ultimately is the most interesting thing going on in the tail end of this show. But really also her character goes nowhere by the end of this. Really nowhere, I believe. They ultimately tell you exactly where she's going, but I'm like, so that is the dumbest way to get rid of this character. So we end up having it to where Marshall is to ultimately go. I think I'm gonna have to do every single character and go back and just kind of finish up their arcs and their second halves of these things. So let's go on to Marshall first. So we have it to where ultimately Marshall is to go and seemingly enter in his movie for a festival. And so ultimately we have it to where Marshall is to go to New York. So reasonably we have it to where Marshall ends up going with his dad to New York, and it's interesting to see that ultimately Max has something to do in this story, because he really has nothing. You ultimately have it to where Marshall and Max are going onto a plane, and we find out that seemingly Max is terrified of being on a plane, and we have it to where ultimately Max is flipping out. To ultimately he's desperately asking to get medication that uh, ultimately is from Tara. We ultimately have it to where still Kate is the stewardess, and eventually on their plane ride back, we ultimately have Kate, who ultimately is to go and help Max, her father, with the plane ride back. It's kind of interesting. So we end up having it to where Max is already like crazy about, or Max is going crazy over flying a plane not only once but twice. But also when looking at that, he's still carrying around all of the other stuff, all of Tara's stuff, all of just family problems, how he hates his job because ultimately um, he has to use none of his intelligence to do any portion of his job. And so we end up having it to where eventually Max loses his effing mind when eventually they are to have their last real supper. So, plus also it seems that ultimately we had it at some point where Max's mother comes into the fray. We ultimately have it to where ultimately Max had to go and clean up his mother's home because ultimately she's a hoarder. And we end up having it to where um, Max ends up spending some time with uh, Max's father or Max's mother to hear what ended up happening to Max's father, seemingly during some Christmas time. Or we have it to where I think Max's mother just likes to put up Christmas decorations whenever just because she really likes Christmas. I don't know exactly the timeline of things. I think that they just had to rush a lot of things just to get certain holidays done and so on and so forth. So ultimately we have it to where I will get more into Marshall, but I'm going to switch now to Kate. So Kate has it to ultimately she's a airplane stewardess. It seems like she is eventually going to have uh, a guy that she otherwise desperately tried to ask out on a date, and ultimately that horribly went awry. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that Kate is very reluctant to talk to this guy anymore, but eventually it seems that this guy is going to win her over, and ultimately it seems like these two people live in two different states, and but ultimately they are trying to make it work. It seems that we are going to have it to where Kate's boyfriend ultimately brings along Marty or Morty or Marty um, to ultimately see Kate and her father and brother when ultimately they can all be in the same place at the same time together. So we end up having it to a reasonably. So Kate and uh, Kate and her boyfriend are ultimately going and having dinner together with the family. And so ultimately it seems like when they're all going together with the family, that it seems like a lot of people are ultimately saying, like, I think he could be the one for you. I think he could be the guy. You ultimately have it to where reasonably Kate and her boyfriend are ultimately like contemplating moving to St. Louis, and ultimately Kate is like, you know what, I would rather stay here and be with my brother than move to St. Louis. And ultimately, we have it to where Kate's boyfriend tells her that he loves her. kind of cementing that they're kind of in some wiggle room of where the heck they're even going to go. We ultimately have it to where supposedly Marshall, towards the tail end of this, is ultimately after we find out that Marshall had gone to the festival, and we had heard also that Lionel had died. We ultimately find out Lionel, which was Marshall's boyfriend, which ultimately it seemed that him and Marshall were having an argument, and eventually we have it where Marshall was asking Lionel to F him, and Lionel just kind of just said no about it. We ultimately have it to where they had a funeral for Lionel. Barely. They just kind of talked about it and whatever. They never really actually went to a funeral thing to ultimately do any proceedings or whatever. They just had it to where I think they were going to the funeral, and that's about it. Because heaven forbid they want to spend any more money to get another different environment to be a part of the show. So, going on into here, so we eventually have it to where Marshall is going to quite possibly end up with Charmaine and Neil. Two people that barely had anything really going on in these episodes. We ultimately have it to where Charmaine ultimately had some problems with her baby repetitiously screaming, to the point where ultimately she went on a spa day and ultimately got some nice clothes for herself, because ultimately she thought that she should treat herself right, because it seems like she had met some other mothers that were drinking and were a bad influence. And when looking at it, we have it to where Charmaine is easily just manipulated, or otherwise just wanting to do something good for herself anyways, rather than anyone else. So, that's really the only thing that Charmaine had anything to do with anything in this show. So, for the last half, the first half is basically Neil and Charmaine 24/7. We eventually, and also we end up having it to where Charmaine ultimately asks Neil to marry her, and Neil ultimately says no. Then he says, like, hey, you know how that feels? Like, you get how that feels? You get it? And then ultimately he says, sure, I will definitely marry you. Ultimately, it seems like Charmaine and Neil are supposedly going to Kentucky, but none of that is really all confirmed, because ultimately they want to eventually see where Marshall is going to end up, because ultimately it's hot potato with Marshall. We end up having it to where Marshall is just all like, yeah, I don't really care where I end up because the show is ending, kind of thing. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so what is going on with Tara? Why is it that all of a sudden everyone is leaving? Supposedly for St. Louis or Kentucky or whatever. So we end up having it to where, let's get into Tara, because Max does nothing for these other episodes, with the exclusion of one dinner debacle, which I will bring up eventually. So we end up finding out that ultimately in the second half, seemingly of this here, we ultimately find out that it seems that Tara is ultimately having difficulties reaching her psychologist teacher, and it seems that ultimately he will not talk to Tara for some bizarre reason. We ultimately have it to where Tara ends up going in as different alters to talk to this psychologist teacher, and eventually we find out that it seems that the prior patient that ultimately the psychologist had wrote a book on, that patient had died. He had died tying a string onto his ankle, supposedly. So we were to assess that ultimately this guy had never really gotten through this whole illness, that ultimately he had just decided to just figure a way out of how to die. And so that's what he had done. So we end up having it because ultimately it seems that Tara is in a whirlwind, and it ultimately seems like there is no way out for her. That ultimately she otherwise all of a sudden alters into another persona called Bryce. It seems like at first it seems that Bryce ends up going and cutting Tara. And so it seems that Bryce's objective is to try and get rid of all the other alters to where only Tara and him are left. So we slowly but surely end up having it to where ultimately, so we end up in one episode having Tara going through this cornfield, and ultimately Tara bizarrely turns into Chicken, and Chicken is ultimately terrified about this cornfield because evidently in her past there was something related to some cornfield that ultimately had led her to be crazy for some reason. I don't know why. So we end up having it to where ultimately Bryce is slowly but surely going after these personas, and eventually the psychologist teacher is ultimately going to go out of his way to say, you know what, like, I'm going to be your therapist-esh like person to try to help you through all of this. So because we end up having it to where the therapist or the psychologist ends up going with Tara into this cornfield to try and understand why is it that she turned into Chicken. So we end up having it to where Tara and this psychologist, I think I'll just call him, I just don't care for the name, because ultimately I just didn't IMDb this one. I'm just going straight off of just like, yeah, whatever I remember is what I remember. We'll call him Doctor because that'll be quicker to ultimately just keep saying that. So ultimately we have it to where Doc and Tara ends up going into this cornfield, and so ultimately we have it to where Tara ends up grabbing a stuffed doll that seems to be all disheveled and all beaten up. Where ultimately, eventually, we have it to where Doc ends up following on to finding Tara with this stuffed animal to basically say that ultimately Bryce had supposedly killed Chicken. Great. So ultimately, we are to find that Bryce's character is supposed to be Tara's stepbrother in the persona of being almost an axe murderer. We end up having it to where ultimately Tara is trying to take medication to subdue all of her alters, aka Bryce, because eventually we have it to where Bryce is killing the alters one by one, when eventually it seems that Tara isn't taking her medication. So it's like we have it to where Tara is ultimately realizing there's a alter that can hurt her, but she's not taking the medication to prevent this alter from hurting her. So she's just kind of letting, like, God, is that just the worst thing possible? You have it to where this person knows full well there's an alter that is going to hurt her, and she's just willy-nilly letting it happen anyways, pretty much. So we end up having it to where eventually, so they end up having it to where I guess they have to compile so many holidays together. Like, it seems like in one episode it's Halloween, the next episode it's Thanksgiving, the next episode is Christmas. Like, that kind of approach to the tail end of the season, or just kind of get every holiday out of the way for some bizarre reason that made no sense. So on and so forth. So we end up having it to where it's some episode they end up pumpkin carving. So we have it to where eventually this is just to lead Bryce ending up putting on this pumpkin and ultimately ending up stabbing Gimme, or what is to be Gimme's poncho, to ultimately help us realize that Gimme is dead now. Sure. We ultimately have it to where the psychologist is ultimately going and talking to Bryce, and ultimately just trying to, like, decipher what the heck is going on. We ultimately have it to where the psychologist had mentioned that before, that he had been deathly allergic to I think seafood. So we ultimately have it to at some point that it seems that Bryce had been making food for a lot of the people, and we end up finding it that the psychologist ends up eating what Tara makes. And we end up finding out that the meal that had been made was actually seafood that was made for the psychologist, so ultimately he would basically die. We ultimately have it to where the psychologist realizes that it's seafood, and he ends up like going and saying like, "Call the hospital, call the police, call whoever." So we end up having it to where ultimately the psychologist ends up getting away with being able to eat this seafood and I guess probably barf it all out, or ultimately be able to survive this threat of Bryce. So we end up having it to where Bryce is seemingly the main alter, and he keeps showing up to throw shade to a lot of the characters, ultimately throwing shade to Marshall when his boyfriend had died. He is talking to Kate and ultimately talking to her in a seductive manner, ultimately mentioning like, "Hey, how about you trade up and be with a real man," which ultimately is Tara. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably one by one the alters are starting to get more and more scared that eventually they are going and like saying their last rites to whoever. Basically we have it to where T ends up having a little conversation with uh Kate, ultimately like saying about all the good times that they had. Funny enough, we end up having it to where Kate ended up saying at one point about her talking about the stories of the birds and the bees, how she figured everything out. How we had it to where ultimately, like, to where some of the altars we end up having, like, Bulk, a buck, end up giving Kate some adult videos, which was really confusing. We end up having Alice, I think, giving her the birds and bees story. We end up having T ultimately showing how to give BJs to whoever, and so ultimately we had it to where Kate learned a thing or two from some of these people, and so ultimately we end up having Kate who is talking to T, and T like barely is like you can like hear it's T, but nothing of Tara's body looks anything like T. It's basically just like, well, this is just Bryce, and basically he's gonna she's gonna barely look like T at all. We end up having it to where T ultimately bows out, talking to Kate, ultimately saying like, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen, so ultimately I guess I have to do a farewell, uh, like to talk to Kate and whatever what have you. We ultimately have it to where eventually, uh, Max is ultimately going and kind of getting some things from the refrigerator, and we end up having Buck ending up talking to Max, ultimately asking for one last beer because ultimately he never knows when he's going to be able to get drunk again. Because reasonably, or like we have it to where Buck is basically saying like, this is going to be my last beer. This is going to be my last time ever talking to anybody, and so we have it to where Buck kind of quickly but surely ultimately just says like it was nice being with Max or whatever, and to have his one last beer, and ultimately then he was going to go shortly thereafter. So we end up having it to where reasonably so there isn't a real true actual seemingly death that ultimately otherwise Bryce does. Like, it doesn't seem like Bryce kills every single one of the altars. You don't actually see that. But I guess you would just have to assess that all the other altars are to possibly go into hiding. And so ultimately we have it to where otherwise we have it to where Max and Tara ultimately decide to just go and move to Boston. Because story. Reasonably, there isn't. I don't think there was an actual, real, legitimate reason for moving to Boston. I think it was just a new location to ultimately get Tara, like, to be free from all of these altars, I would assess, because when looking at it, Bryce probably killed every single one of the altars, and so ultimately the reason why to go to Boston was probably to assess whether or not Tara or Bryce was going to make it out of all this, because ultimately looking at it, we end up having it to our tail endingly just having nothing really resolved at the end of this. We end up having it to where I guess we just have to naturally assume that Bryce killed every single one of the altars with the exclusion of Tara. And then that's about it. That's all you have to really assess. Because ultimately we just have it to where Tara ends up cutting her hair shorter, supposedly to ultimately look much more like a boy, I guess, or to reasonably just have it to be that Bryce's persona is so powerful that ultimately he's going to have his hair cut shorter, which I don't know. I think that reasonably just like I don't know. I think reasonably with Tara, they had to like probably write in the fact that she's just gonna cut her hair short. Like she's just like, dude, I had my hair so long for all of these altars, and so now I'm just gonna freaking cut it. Is probably what happened. She's probably just like, I just want to cut my hair, and that's what I want to do. And ultimately, they're just like, okay, fine, we'll just write it in the story that Bryce wanted the hair shorter, and hence why your hair is shorter now. Like, I think a lot of the times, I think a lot of people didn't give an F about the way that this show just ended. And so ultimately, they were just like, well, I'll just cut my hair now, or I'll just do this, because when looking at it, like, what are you going to do? Fire me? The show is already ending, so we'll just figure out a way to write in haircuts and stuff like that. So really, that's just how everything just resolves. That's how everything ends. That's how the entire show goes off, with just Tara going to supposedly Boston, putting her head out the window like a dog and just going, like just feeling the air on her skin. And we have it to where everybody else is just kind of holding hands in the front of the yard, and ultimately just like as if they're gonna like bow at some point. They're gonna have their last bow and then leave or whatever. Like the old fashioned approach where everyone will put their hands together and then just bow and then leave, kind of at the end of the show. Like that's what I felt like everyone was doing bizarrely. Was all holding their hands together and whatever, what have you. Really, I think again, I really liked the beginning of this show. Like, this show started off, like, really good and really interesting, but man, did it just heavily fizzle. It fizzled horribly bad to ultimately when looking at the very last episodes, I'm like, this is how you end this show? Like, man, you could have had it at a, like, you couldn't have had it at a like a more triumphant kind of really ending where it kind of felt like, hey, like we haven't been writing this show for really I don't know how long, and so like now we're gonna put some real effort into writing some stuff. We ultimately have it to where Max's mother is kind of dipped into the story, and ultimately we have it to where we have some backstory of Max's father, but then also it seems that ultimately Bryce ultimately being tied with Max's mother, and Max's mother really likes Christmas, and we'll ultimately have Tara was ultimately messing with some of the Christmas stuff, and Tara was like, you know what, I don't care who you are, if you mess with my Christmas stuff, I'm going to snap your fingers, kind of thing. Was kind of interesting, but yeah, there wasn't much for me to say about that whole Christmas stuff or Max's mother, because that story went nowhere, as well as any number of other people. Kind of didn't really go anywhere at the tail end of this season. So I think that's all I have to say, really and truly, about this show. Really, 3 seasons, and ultimately, I really just was like, huzzah, this show is over kind of thing. Huzzah for me. Because ultimately I liked the beginning of it, but I felt after that, I felt like, man, this is kind of work watching the show. It's really work watching the show because it just, like, man, like the first season strong, and then anything after that was just like, man, like I didn't like all the journeys of which everybody went. Tara kind of felt like a deflating character that all like. That's the biggest problem when you have a name in the title, like Dexter. Like Dexter's show was always about Dexter, and then reasonably we had so many other people tied to Dexter's story, but it always focal pointed into Dexter every single time for every single thing. Whereas this show, it kind of like got so jumbled and so mix moshed and so everywhere that like it didn't feel like Tara's show anymore. It just kind of felt like everybody's like, well, I want my time in the sun, so ultimately I can be benefited by going off and doing something else. Like I feel there was a lot of dissension in the ranks of just like Tara trying to ultimately say like, well, I really want this person to get a really good story, and I want this person to get a really good story because hopefully they'll go and they'll be a bigger star after this kind of thing. We ultimately have Marshall, who is ultimately going to Atypical. We ultimately have Bree, who is basically Captain Marvel right now, and any number of other things, which ultimately is what it is with that actress. Tara ultimately, yeah, she's kind of done some shows here and there. We ultimately have it to her max. Ultimately, um, don't know. Like recently, I rarely ever see the guy, and then ultimately when I do see him, it's like, oh hey, yeah, there he is again. We ultimately had it to her max. Ultimately, kind of rekindles his heydays of ultimately being a musician, and at some point he ends up just consistently playing a guitar, seemingly out in the middle of the neighborhood. Where ultimately, eventually, people have qualms with Max playing his guitar too loud, but eventually we have Ted walking in, ultimately razzing anybody that is going to say crap to Max about anything. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.